Hello and welcome to this very special first chapter interview with Dr. Wolfgang Smith concerning the upcoming release of his new, and I hesitate to say it, but final book. We said the book in 2019, Physics and Vertical Causation, was going to be his final book because he told us that it was going to be his final book. And here he has gone ahead and written another one at 90 years of age. And this one is so stupendous that we figured this was probably going to be the last one, too. I must hedge my bet on this because he has produced two new essays in the last month that are so absolutely mind boggling that I must confess I remain an agnostic on whether this is actually going to be his final book. Anyway, we are blessed with a tremendous outpouring of work from Wolfgang. And by the way, Wolfgang is just about to celebrate his 91st birthday in February. And so the release of this stunning new book, The Vertical Ascent, From Particles to the Tripartite Cosmos and Beyond, is our first really big piece of news for the new year of 2021. So first of all, let me welcome you, Dr. Smith, and Happy New Year, and say hi to all of our friends and let us know how you're doing.
Well, thank you so much, Rick. I'm doing remarkably well, and I'm happy to have this opportunity to exchange some thoughts with you.
Excellent. I'm sure that your many friends will be very interested to hear about the new book. And I would just like to begin today because we have just posted an excerpt from Bruno Berard's absolutely exceptional um, prologue to the book. And I would like to just start the conversation today by sort of situating our discussion in terms of a very important point that I think Bruno makes about this book. He says, such a twofold comprehension of the cosmos, qua both scientist and metaphysician, constitutes in fact the salient characteristic of Wolfgang Smith. Drawing upon a profound grasp of foundational physics, along with certain other basic scientific disciplines such as neuroscience and astrophysics, it is his wont to penetrate into the underlying metaphysics, thereby casting the issues in a brand new light. Typically, it turns out that having done so, the prima facie difficulties that motivated the inquiry, which appeared insurmountable on the level at which they were originally conceived, prove to be readily tractable when thus viewed on deeper ground. Now, what impresses me about this insight, Doctor, is that this is exactly why, almost 30 years ago now, you were able to resolve the quantum enigma in your famous book of that same title, The Quantum Enigma. And I would like to ask you to address this insight of Bruno's that when you look at a scientific question, the thing that characterizes you and sort of separates you is that you always look at it also from the metaphysical side of things. And could you please address that also in terms of this new book, of the things you are looking at that are scientific problems that are being addressed not only from the scientific but the metaphysical side of the question? Go ahead.
Well, you ask a very penetrating question. The fact of the matter is that the so-called scientific way of looking at the world is a little bit like coming into the theater in the middle of the play. It doesn't really start at the beginning, and from a wider point of view, it therefore doesn't fully make sense. In other words, by the time the physicist begins to explain to you his vision of the world, he has done something to this world. He has prepared the ground, so to speak, for his particular vision. And basically, what the physicist's way of looking at the world amounts to is an atomization of wholeness. The world consists primarily of wholes. Now, the wholeness is more basic, more fundamental, and more real than an assemblage of parts. But this is what the physicist does before he begins his inquiry even. He atomizes. He replaces wholes, well, in principle, by an infinitude of parts defined by the three coordinates of space and the single coordinate of time. So in other words, the physicist starts in a four-dimensional universe. Now this four-dimensional universe has a certain reality of its own, of course, otherwise there could be no physics, but it is not the primary reality. It is a reduced reality. The fact of the matter is that wholeness precedes the partition into spatiotemporal atoms. The whole is more real than the parts. And in fact, the whole in itself is irreducible to its parts. So by the time the physicist begins to look at the world, he has changed it, he has reduced it. It is no longer whole, and therefore it is no longer completely real, because ultimately reality is wholeness. Being is wholeness. Incidentally, the scholastics understood this very well, and they had a little formula for it. They said, ens et unum convertuntur. So that means oneness or being and oneness amount to the same thing. There are two different ways of looking at the same thing. So where you have being, there must be a oneness, a unity, and where there is a true unity, there must be a being.
Marvelous, marvelous, marvelous. Now, this is a profoundly important key, I think, to understanding your entire life's work. All of your published works proceed from the refusal to accept this initial assumption of the physicist that the world reduces to particles and fields, and that every perceived wholeness, perceived essence, perceived being is an illusion that must be stripped away. And this has led us ultimately to what we have covered in great detail in the film, and you, of course, have covered for decades in your work, of the literal dead end at which this entire project is now quite obviously arriving. And the great breakthrough you made in the quantum enigma was to distinguish hierarchically between what you call the physical universe, which is the universe of particles, the universe of fields, the universe of equations, the universe of the physicist, on the one hand, and what you call the corporeal world, which is the universe in which we live, where your sweater is a nice burnt orange color, and I can put my hand on this table and I can say, you know what, by golly, you may say this is a collection of particles. I say it's a table. And your tremendous resolution of the quantum enigma was based on recognizing this demarcation, this distinction between the physical and the corporeal. But it doesn't stop there, does it? And in the title of your new book, The Vertical Ascent, you say we go from particles, which would be the physical, to the tripartite cosmos and beyond. So it seems to me that in the new book, you are moving even higher than this distinction between the physical and the corporeal. Could you tell us a little bit about that, please?
Yes, the corporeal world, of course, is distinguished from the physical in the sense that it consists of wholes, wholeness, and therefore it has being, because without wholeness, as I said earlier, there is no being. But it turns out that there are degrees of wholeness, and corporeal wholeness, which is a wholeness subject to spatial and temporal bounds, is, so to speak, the lowest form. But let's remain with that lowest form for a little bit, because it is important to distinguish that corporeal level from the physical. The point is that the corporeal level is characterized by a certain kind of wholeness, a wholeness subject to spatio-temporal divisions, but nonetheless an irreducible wholeness in its own right. And incidentally, this is why the corporeal world is perceptible, because what we perceive ultimately is a wholeness. We never just perceive parts. Let me give you an example. The corporeal world is characterized not only by quantities, by how many of this or that, but also by qualities, which answer not to the question how many, but to the question what. Take for an example a color, like the color red. It is obviously a whole because red has no parts. It is one thing, namely red. And this is why it has being, and this is why you can perceive red. You can't perceive a pure quality because it does not answer to the question what. It answers to the question how many, how much. And you don't perceive a how many, you don't perceive a how much. What you perceive is a what. And there is no whatness in the physicist's universe. The physical universe, defined as the universe conceived by the physicist, has no what in it. It consists only of how much. And this is also why it has no being. And in technical terms, what this means is that physical entities are a potentia, a potency. They have an aptitude for being, but in itself, they have no being as such. And this is really the quintessence of my first book, The Quantum Enigma. I elaborated upon this. I made all the necessary distinctions, and I showed in really complete detail the fact that the physical lacks being, that the physical is a potency, and that it is actualized in the act of measurement or display. What would be display? Display would be using an oscilloscope to represent, say, fluctuations of voltage in visual terms, and you see an actual sine curve. So this is in addition to measurement, this is a way of actualizing physical entities. To actualize a physical entity, you have to make it perceptible, and the perceptible is the corporeal.
Well, I remember very clearly, long before I ever met you, years before I ever met you, I managed to find your essay responding to Stephen Hawking. I think you wrote it back in 2011, about 10 years ago now. And there was one sentence that just literally changed my life. I knew I had to find you. I spent many years looking for you and finally did find you. But that sentence was this: the physical stands to the corporeal as potency to act. And that is one of the most absolutely mind-boggling sentences I've ever read. By the way, there are several more in the new book. And in the coming weeks, as we talk more about the specific chapters in the new book, we'll cover some of that. Pardon me. But that statement, that the physical stands to the corporeal as potency to act, was what actually launched me on a years-long course toward ultimately finding you, meeting you, befriending you, and us launching our initiative. So, okay, so we have established that this world of the physicist has potential for existence, but in itself is not adequate to account for the things, the wholenesses, the beings that we encounter in our daily lives. Now, in the new book, you take us higher even than the corporeal. And I wonder if you might talk to us a little bit about what you discover at the next higher level of this tripartite cosmos.
Wholeness, in the sense of irreducible wholeness, actually originates in the highest stratum of the cosmos, which transcends both the bounds of space and time. This is a very deep insight of primordial metaphysics, which I believe was known to the wise for thousands of years. It is particularly associated with the philosophy of Plato and the Neoplatonists. So it belongs primarily to the Platonist school. However, in a moderated version, you find it in the other great metaphysical schools, for example, the Aristotelian. But the way the Platonists formulate that idea of wholeness as transcending both spatial and temporal divisions it is primary. It goes beyond the Aristotelian vision, for example, although the two are really compatible. There's this book called Aristotle and Other Platonists. I like the title because it emphasizes a point that is often forgotten. The great philosophers fundamentally agree with one another. Disagreement enters when, so to speak, lesser minds get into the discussion. So the reason the cosmos divides quite naturally into three levels is because there is, first of all, pure wholeness, transcending space and time. And then there is, in the second place, a wholeness still transcending the bounds of space, but nonetheless subject to the bounds of time. And thirdly, there is the corporeal world that we now are conscious of in our daylight hours, at least, our waking state, which is manifestly a world subject to both the bound of time and the bound of space. Now, let me say a word or two about the second of these three domains. This intermediary domain, which is obviously of major importance, is virtually unknown in the contemporary world. Even the highly educated people in general are unaware that there is such a cosmic domain. Let me mention that in the 19th century in Europe, there was a kind of tradition of occultism. There were the so-called media, usually women, who had a gift, a certain capacity to enter into this intermediary plane, to some degree at least, and it enabled them to get various bits of information which you could not otherwise get. And in those days, it was referred to as the astral plane. In the Orthodox Church, there is some knowledge of that has survived. It's referred to as the aerial world. When I contacted Malachi Martin on a radio interview, I recall, the subject came up, and he was very familiar with the intermediary world because he was an expert exorcist. So when he was parlaying with the demonic realm, he realized that this is something that was transacted on the intermediary level. So I'm saying this in order to emphasize that this intermediary level is not just a concept, an idea, a philosophical notion, but it's a very, very real thing, as real as our corporeal world to which we are normally limited. So there are these three realms, and the authentic wholeness, what I call irreducible wholeness, originates on the highest. I refer to it in my book mainly as the aeviternal realm. That is where irreducible wholeness, so to speak, resides. It's a very difficult concept to get into our mind because we are creatures of the corporeal world, and it is very hard for us to entertain conceptions which transcend the fundamental conditions of that corporeal world.
Well, this is very true, but I would point out that it was very difficult for us to understand that there was an actual distinction between the physical and the corporeal until you demonstrated that the measuring problem in quantum mechanics was the great signifier of that distinction. In your book, you point to another serious problem of modern science as a signifier of this next level, the boundary between the corporeal and the intermediary. And this brings us to the ever famous binding problem, which you address in the new book. And you consider this to be a sign of the boundary between the corporeal and the intermediary, just as the measuring problem in quantum mechanics is a sign of the boundary between the physical and the corporeal. I wonder if you might tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I would say that most cognitive psychologists in our day, people who study, for example, human perception, beginning with visual perception, are materialistic in their worldview, which means that they are persuaded a priori, based upon their general worldview, that perception is simply a matter of neurons picking up a retinal image contained in the rods and cones of the retina, and somehow processing that image via neurons moving off into various visual centers in the cortex. Well, tremendous amount of research has been done, and what the researchers are picking up, so to speak, is real. They are actually studying neuronal currents in various parts of the brain. And this is a very intricate story, and libraries have been filled with the empirical results of this investigation. Now, the problem is, where is what we actually see? There are more than 20 so-called visual centers in the cortex of the human brain. And what is it that we see? And what our scientists are doing is they are discovering actually millions and perhaps even billions of neuronal processes associated with the task of seeing a corporeal object. Say, a red apple in my hand. I see that red apple as a single corporeal entity. And how do I see it? Well, the neuronal scientists are perplexed, because what they are finding are millions and perhaps even billions, as I said, neurons in various states of excitement. And where's the picture? Where's the red apple? Well, this is what in the literature is referred to as a binding problem. How do you bind together all these neurons, or the states of these neurons? And the fact of the matter is that no one has the ghost of an idea. And the reason they don't have a ghost of an idea is that on the basis of their Weltanschauung, the categories in terms of which they try to understand the world, it simply cannot be done. So what I pointed out in one of the chapters of the book, Vertical Ascent, is that the binding is accomplished not on the corporeal level, but on the next level up, where it can be accomplished simply because the bound of space is transcended. Incidentally, in days gone by, almost every child could understand that, because every child knew from what it was told that what makes a living being, say a human being, is his anima or soul. So if you don't have a soul, you're not a living being and you don't see anything. And what is a soul? A soul is something pertaining to the intermediary plane, because the soul is subject to time, obviously, because sometimes we're happy, sometimes we are sad. So our soul is subject to time, but here's the crucial point: it is not subject to space. And it is for this reason that the soul is able to resolve the binding problem, because what is separated in space in the form of this neuronal complexity is unified into one picture in the soul.
Wow. Well, that right there makes me want to read the book again. I've read it several times, of course, during your editing process. I think it is safe to say, Wolfgang, that in this new book, you have taken the breakthrough you made 30 years ago in the quantum enigma of recognizing the distinction between the physical and the corporeal, and have now pushed us up, not only to the boundary between the corporeal and the intermediary, but as we'll get to in later episodes of our discussion, even to the boundary between the intermediary and the ev-eternal or celestial realm, the true center of the world. And of course, this all comes back to the famous cosmic icon, which has been a theme running through your work since the very beginning, since Cosmos and Transcendence. And it's, of course, in all of our literature on the website. It's all in the film. And this simple icon of a point in the center and a line out to a circumference and then a circle, with the outer circle representing the corporeal, the inner space representing the intermediary, and that point in the middle representing the ev-eternal or celestial, is the key to understanding your whole life's work. So we're going to wrap it up here for this week. We'll be going into much more detail in coming episodes. Wolfgang, I wonder if you could just tell our audience, not that most of them need, I mean, just the mere fact that there's a new book by Wolfgang Smith. You don't need to know why to buy it. It's a new book by Wolfgang Smith. You have to buy it. But for those of us who are just starting to take the journey with you, what is the reason that you feel that you have something to share with the people of this very, very dark time, this time of great turmoil, this time where it seems that, as we say in the film, all of the pillars are wobbling at once? What is it that you have to share with them in this book?
Well, what I have to share in this book is the fact that what may be called the rediscovery of the tripartite cosmos and beyond is not just an academic exercise, something very interesting theoretically, but it is an existential necessity. We need that as much as we need to breathe. We need to breathe in order to maintain this corporeal life. But we need to understand in this existential and yet metaphysical sense in order to live on a human plane. In other words, some measure of awareness, of irreducible wholeness is necessary to maintain a human existence. Beneath that, the existence that we can have hardly justifies the epithet human, because it is a kind, below that it is not really human, it is animal. We can eat and we can enjoy pleasure and pain, and we can go from one stimulus to the other, immerse ourselves in this and that, but that's not human life. Human life is predicated upon a certain knowledge of wholeness, irreducible wholeness, and the higher this wholeness that we intuit or know, the more fully human we are. So our scientific culture, which is not really scientific in the sense that it is not based upon empirical evidence. It is based upon a priori judgments. This atomization is not something that is simply true. It is something that is postulated, and then on the basis of this assumption, we can build up our scientific findings, and these have a certain pragmatic validity. But it is not a question of understanding, because understanding is predicated upon irreducible wholeness. And so to the extent that we have eliminated this very conception from our mind, we are incapable of understanding anything, really. So what I'm saying is that what I'm really trying to do with this last book is to open people's minds, people's intellect, to the notion of irreducible wholeness and to an awareness, an ever increasing awareness of that integral wholeness. And my beef, so to speak, the object of my criticism, is the modern scientific worldview, which is aimed at precisely the opposite. It is aimed at breaking everything into an atomistic state of disintegration, and then using this in order to obtain a kind of scientific understanding of things. It is true that if you're only interested in predicting quantitative events, this strategy of breaking things down works very fine. But if you want to understand anything as it truly is, it not only doesn't work well, it doesn't work at all. And this is what I think the intelligent reader, after reading my book, will understand.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Smith, and we will, God permitting, be spending some time with you in the coming weeks to address specific chapters and ideas in the book. But I'm so grateful to you for giving our friends and wonderful supporters of the initiative an overview of what they can expect in this marvelous and stunning new book. Let me just say, first of all, I want to wish you in advance and on behalf of your many friends and followers throughout the world a happy, happy, happy birthday coming up in February. I also want to mention that we have been unfortunately required to postpone what we had hoped would be our first international conference on vertical causation and physics. We wanted to celebrate it on your birthday, and COVID has come along and made us postpone that. So we will be focusing for the immediate future on this wonderful new book. Please, please, please get a hold of it, read it, tell your friends, your thoughtful friends who understand that we truly have now entered into a period of history where all of the pillars are wobbling. Don't be afraid of that. That's the best news we could ever have hoped for. The certainty of the materialist enterprise is leaking out like a hot air balloon that has sprung umpteen links. Now is the time for a superior integral view of the world, very much like Thomas Aquinas did back in his day. We propose to the interested observer that Wolfgang Smith is accomplishing a similar and in my opinion, comparably important reintegration of the world. In fact, I believe that his Tripartite Cosmos turns the world right side up again. And the book, the Vertical Ascent, which will be available, is already available for pre-order and will be shipping in the very, very near future, is an important and indeed indispensable part of that recovery of a world turned right side up. So, on behalf of the Philos-Sophia Initiative and Dr. Wolfgang Smith, this is Rick DeLano, thanking you for spending some time with us today. And we will be back with future episodes, God permitting, in the coming weeks. Thanks again, and Godspeed.